So today we are with Amy, whom I met mentoring at Launch 22, one of the co-working spaces we love in central London. And Amy she defines herself as the trainer of ambitious entrepreneurs, leaders, senior executives, and corporations to become powerful communicators, pitchers, and public speakers. And in this day and age, everybody needs to be able to communicate. Their message needs to get across what they need to say. So I think pitching is a lifelong skill, and that's why I asked her to be a guest in the Startup Sessions podcast, and she kindly said yes. So Amy's guest star today. Hello, Amy.
Hi, nice to be here.
So thank you for taking the time to be a part of this podcast. I mean, we got a lot of things that I want to discuss with you, and let's just get right down to it. When do you need the skills to pitch? Can you start with that, and maybe we can segue to your story after we make an intro with that.
Sure. So I actually personally believe that we always need to pitch, whether it's in our business life or personally. In fact, I don't even like the word pitch. I don't really use it, although that's how I have initially defined myself. Really teach people to have meaningful conversations. So I don't really teach people to sell, but I do teach them to be able to communicate their businesses in a meaningful way, and which isn't really about selling, but ironically will present you in a much better light. So I don't actually use the word pitch, although it is pitching that I'm teaching if we want to be formal about it. And in terms of having meaningful conversations about your business proposition or with whomever you're speaking to, that is applicable to every aspect of your life. And so
That's very interesting. And sorry to interrupt. Is the key? Can we say the key difference between pitching and meaningful conversations is that in a meaningful conversation, it's not one-sided. It's two-sided, and you need to understand what the other person is feeling, thinking, asking.
Absolutely, because how can you pitch to anyone unless you have found out about that person first and what they might be interested in and what they might need? People often think that they just go around willy-nilly pitching to all and sundry, and it's very misguided because you're not taking into account the audience that you're attempting to reach. And so the first thing you need to do is find out about who you're speaking to, and you do that by asking questions, which people might think, oh, well, that's not pitching, but you can't pitch until you do your due diligence on the person or audience you're speaking to. And that always starts with questioning.
Oh, I see. And what kind of questions should we think?
Well, it depends on, it's complicated because it depends on the situation you're in. Obviously, if you're in a formal pitching situation where you're speaking to a room of, say, investors, and this is to the entrepreneurs out there, you can't walk in and just start asking them questions, but then you can do your research beforehand and find out, if you can, about every single person that's going to be in that room and what interests them and where their particular interests lie, so that you can tailor your pitch or whatever it is that you want to say according to the people in the room. Now, sometimes that's very difficult to do, but you've got to try your best to do that. And I think in terms of actual questions, that's much more appropriate, obviously, in a conversation. And most pitches aren't formal pitches, they're conversations. So I like to get to questions first before, I've got to pitch too. And I want to get to questions first before I pitch anything, because otherwise I'm not actually speaking to the person in front of me. I'm just coming with some pre-prepared, almost script that can often miss the mark.
That's true. It's just like copy pasting an email, and people don't like that.
Of course. Yeah. And I think
making the same pitch. And I don't want to drift too far away from the main conversation here, but I think this is a very integral part of it. And this is something I experience as well in interviews, in dialogues, in meeting with lots of people. Who gets to ask the questions first and who gets to ask more questions essentially has to do with the power dynamics between the two people. Do you think that is the case?
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I guess, like, for me personally, I just read the situation and I don't mind the other person asking me questions if they want to go first. If they happen to go first, if they jump straight in, then I'm like, yay, great.
Mm,
Who doesn't like talking about themselves?
that's true. That's true.
But I also love to ask the questions, and I think it's a bit of a dance, really. It doesn't really matter who starts, as long as you don't allow yourself to give full power to the other person. Because when you do that, you become very submissive, and if you let the other person take the lead the whole time, they're going to pick up this sense of you don't really have initiative. And so, let's say you're an entrepreneur, you're not going to look very dynamic if you're just being led by the other person in a conversation. So it really is a two-way
Interesting.
dance. So I can't really answer the question specifically. I don't know who starts. Someone must, I guess. Often people wait, I find,
Mm.
for the other person to begin, whoever that person might be. Or the person who's in an authoritative position might think that they need to begin. But
Oh,
again,
I see.
it's still a dance to me. Like, I don't really see it that way. I don't
So,
think that
so you got
there.
to feel the conversation and what the other person is thinking. So it's just so pitching in that sense is or having meaningful conversations is just a performance where you have to act in the moment, read the room, read the people, and so decide simultaneously whether you need to ask or take the lead or answer the questions. Is that a right way of looking at that?
Yeah, I really like the way you said that. I think that's true. And I think, I don't like to think of it in terms of a performance either, although I agree with everything you said. But I think the word performance is quite loaded. And then it can set people up to think that they have to be a certain way to be inspiring and successful and persuade people. And I don't believe that's the case. I think it's more about, yes, being in the moment, going into a situation, be it with a single investor in a room, let's say, or a whole audience of people that you're trying to convince. And rather than deciding beforehand how you're going to play it and how you're going to be, daring instead to allow yourself to step into the spontaneity of the moment and read the situation so that you can come in with the best thing to say in that moment, given what you're getting from the audience or the one person
Okay.
that's in front of you. And I think that's the most powerful way to play it. And it's the most dangerous way to play it. And not many people are brave enough to do that. And I understand why. But I think that's what you need to aim for if you really want to pitch powerfully. And I say pitch with inverted commas because, of course, I mean converse. Yeah.
So you've just convinced me not to look at it as a performance, but rather as somewhere you try to be yourself, but you be in a certain frame of mind in a way to engage with the people simultaneously and spontaneously.
Yeah, it's very much about prioritizing connection with the other person or group of people over performance.
I see.
Ultimately,
So
no one cares
uh,
about performance.
yeah,
Ultimately.
yeah, yeah. So please go on. Did I interrupt you?
No, you did, but that's okay.
Oh,
I can't remember what I was about to say. My brain darts off in so many different directions. I was saying that connection is more important than performance. And by performance, I mean trying to impress people because
mm,
you drift very quickly. However, if you try to inspire people and try to find out what makes them tick and speak to that part of the person, you're more likely to engage them in whatever it, and you'll have earned the right to then tell them your story. But you've got to create that trust and connection first. And that's what must be the priority.
I love that connection. So two lessons already. The first is know the audience. The second one, connection over performance. And before we move on to other sections, I'm really curious. There was a book that really inspired me. It was by Carrie Patterson and other colleagues of her, a book called Crucial Conversations. And I think I mentioned it in one of the events that we met. I'm not so sure, but essentially it is based on the idea that in life you're going to have a number of crucial conversations,
Mm.
and they're just going to be so important on the future of your business, personal, and your life in general. And the thing that stuck with me was how similar some skills that great business people have. And how transferable those skills are to our relationships with our friends, with our loved ones, with our family. So, do you think that pitching, or in other words, the conversation with people transfers to other non-business areas in life?
Um, you know, yes, in a word, because I personally don't make much of a distinction between my business life and my personal life. Obviously, there are slightly different roles that I play, but I bring as much authenticity, as much of myself as I can, obviously, to both sections of my life. So I don't want to suddenly be one person in one area and then a completely different person in my personal life, because then I think that I'm not being true to myself. So um, I think it's very important to be able to bring as much as of your personality to all of your dealings with people. Um, that doesn't mean that when you go into business, you start sharing all of your personal problems. That's not what I mean. I mean that you actually converse with people in as much of an authentic way as possible, given the scenario you're in, given that you're in a business scenario. So rather than putting on a faux professional facade, how can you speak to the person in front of you like a human being? Well, normally it comes down to, I think, not even talking about business, first of all. It's often just making that connection, generating a bit of trust, getting rid of the tension. People are often tense when they go into business scenarios. It can be quite scary. You don't know who you're talking to. And I think it's nice to be able to bring a bit of empathy and kindness to those scenarios so that you negate the tension in the room. And then people are much more able to speak about the things that they're passionate about. And then you're much more able to get to the nitty gritty of whatever conversation you want to have. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I mean, build rapport, get to know the person, and build trust. Connection over performance was a very elegant way that you put it, and I'm taking some notes as well. So can you tell me a bit more about your backstory, and
Yeah.
what do you think is about you that makes you very good at what you do in terms of pitching, or whole this expertise area, if you will?
Well, I never really think of myself as, an expert, but I do think of myself as someone who's really interested in human dynamics and human relationships and how to generate success uh, with whomever you're speaking to and collaborating with. And when I say success, I don't mean just my success. I mean
Yeah.
everyone's success, mutual success, like a shared vision. And I'm very interested in that. So I think about it all the time. And the reason I don't say I'm an expert is because I think that I'm constantly learning and evolving. And so although I teach this stuff, I learn just as much from the people I work with as I do, with me just teaching. It's a symbiotic process. I've actually forgotten the question. What was the question? I've gone off. I was
So,
really enjoying my own answer, and then I thought, hang on a minute.
before I disclose the question again, I mean, one point I think is really interesting, and not just for you, but for anyone, is mastery is not a destination that you reach. It's just a journey that doesn't end. I mean, the moment you proclaim yourself as a master, that is the point that you stop learning, and ironically enough, you stop being a master.
Yeah.
So building master is inversely correlated to feeling like a master, I think, in a way. And
Absolutely. Every situation I go into, because I teach a lot of workshops and trainings and I work with people from all walks of life. Every single person is different and every workshop is different. And I walk in and I just go blank slate. I say, clear my brain. I don't know what I'm going to receive. And it could be very different to what, management told me I was going to receive. And it often is. And I walk in blank slate and I learn in the moment. I don't ever go in with any preconceived ideas, because as soon as I do that, I set myself up for failure, because I'm not responding to the moment. I'm responding to my story of what the moment was going to be. So I train very much in the moment, and everybody's so unique. And again, I'm learning as much as I'm teaching. It's
I
amazing. Yeah. I get very excited about it.
yeah, that's a big part of it. I mean, I don't think spontaneity is really easily achievable for all, but it takes a certain level of these 10,000 hours rule or something. So I think it takes certain time to be in the moment and at the same time deliver a certain, I don't want to use the word performance again, but deliver a certain value
Yeah,
to people. And the original question I was curious
yeah.
about was, what is it about your story that
That
brought you here?
was it. That was
And just one addition to that,
yeah, my story.
it is getting really, really complex to pick a career nowadays because there are so many different alternatives, and it is really difficult for people to find their niche and build expertise around that. So how did you come to this point?
Right. So for me, I went to university. I studied economics at LSE, and I was bored out of my brains. I'm not particularly. I am very academic, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. So I left. When I left university, yeah, I went to all the milk round interviews. I don't know if they do milk round interviews anymore, but it was called milk round interviews back then, and I was.
They call it Silicon Milk Roundabout or something, and they have an event coming up in the next few months.
Well, I just remember being ferried from one investment bank to another and being interviewed by these, much older men to become funnily enough, I was going to become a trader. And luckily I failed. So,
God forbid.
yeah, well, I was a very emotional person back then. And so I just used to cry in all my interviews. And they used to say, oh, dear, I think you're too sensitive to be a trader. And yeah, thought about, something art or something creative. And I thought, do you know what? They're right. So I went to drama school and ditched economics and trained to be an actor. And I'm trying to cut a very long story short here. So left drama school, tried to become an actor.
Very interesting story. Do tell, please.
Yeah, tried to become an actor. Did do a couple of films, Blink and You Miss Me, but was in some very big films and got to meet some amazing people. And learned pitching from a very young age because I had to pitch myself to be in these movies. And I was very creative and inventive about the ways I got parts. And I can go into detail if we've got time. But anyway,
Yeah. Do you have an example on the top of your head?
yeah, of course. So I auditioned for Kenneth Branagh, and the reason how I got that audition. I mean, I had an agent at the time, but I never liked to leave my life in the hands of others. I was very self-driven even then. And so I thought, how am I going to get Kenneth Branagh to notice me? I really want to be in his film. Way before email. Like, there wasn't any email at the time. I don't remember emailing anybody. So I was always really ingenious, and I found the email, no, the address, not email, the address. So the postal address of his PA.
Wow.
I found his PA, and I was very good at research. I asked the right questions to the right people. I was always a bit like a spy. And I found this information, and then I did something quite wacky. I wrote him a poem every
Wow.
for at least 3 months, and my poems were ridiculous. They were so zany and silly, and I can't even remember them, but they were just hilarious. And
Did you just say for 3 months?
yeah, for 3 months, one a week, and each one was unique and different. And let me tell you, they weren't poetic; they were just ridiculously silly. It was comedic. And eventually, his PA called me and said, "Okay, we need you to stop writing. Can you just come in? Just come in and meet us." And I was like, yay! So I got to meet Kenneth, and I auditioned with him, and he was my partner in my audition, and we were supposed to do a dance together. And me being who I am and being a bit sort of wacky, instead of letting him lead, I spun him around the dance floor and almost threw him into the wall. And they gave me the part because they thought I was funny. So yeah, that was one of my, you could call it a pitch. That's how I pitched myself.
It is, and I mean, there can't be a better story to tell. You're great at it. I mean, fantastic story.
I just, how I teach people now, just because of all of my experiences and bringing it back to the present moment, I'm always on the side of thinking outside the box, doing something a little bit ingenious without losing respect for yourself or for another person, but definitely trying new things and being resourceful and never allowing a no to set you back. Like, there's always a way. I've never thought that there wasn't a way. I've never been afraid. I've always thought if I can get to Kenneth Branagh at the age of 21 with a couple of poems, you know, There's not much else that I'm afraid of. So, and that's the spirit that I like to teach the people that I work with, because I think the less afraid we are of the results, again, we're going back to the journey, the less afraid we are of outcomes, and the more we want to just simply enjoy the process and discover and try new things and be prepared to fall flat on your face, the better pitchers we become, the more resilient and initiative-taking entrepreneurs we become. There's nothing that can hold us back.
Would you describe yourself as an extrovert, an introvert, or with the new phrasing that is beginning to be used by some psychologists around the world, an ambivert, which is in between an extrovert and an introvert? So where do you think you are in the spectrum?
So I hate labels. So I'm going to put it out there. Extrovert, introvert, ambi, whatever. I'm just like, yeah, okay. But I don't see myself, and I don't like to label other people either, like, because I think that we're all very complicated. And I think that, and I think lots of people listening will relate to this. In some situations, we feel more extroverted, and it really does depend on who we're talking to and the circumstances and even how we feel that day. And then there are other situations where we become a little bit more introverted, again, depending on the outside circumstances and perhaps also how we feel. So
that's true. I agree. I mean, agree with that wholeheartedly. The functional benefit of using such labels or terminologies is they do a very good job of quickly communicating what you're talking about. So that's the reason why I use them. But I agree on the essence of what you're telling. The point that I'm really curious about, and this has been a point of discussion with some other people, and so extroversion. So this was talked about lots of salespeople being very extroverted in the traditional sense of the word. But it turns out the introverts, I mean, still using the label, but just bear with me. So the introvert people tend to sell better. They have higher performance. And one reason for that, a speculated reason, is that introvert people let others have a bigger space for them to tell about themselves. So going back to one of your original points, it is sometimes easier to build relationships in that sense. And with pitching, it tends to be understood as something which extroverts tend to do very well, and introverts tend to be having more difficulty with. So what are your thoughts on that general topic, and how pitching and having meaningful conversations interact with different personality types?
In probably less formal conversations, introverts very good. If you let's for the sake of a label, sort of more people who are more in their shells are very good at giving space to others and listening and being a bit more thoughtful and reflective on a situation, and then perhaps more skilled at not always, but can be more skilled at saying the most connective thing in that moment that can bring the two or three people, however many people in the room, can bring them more together on a certain topic. And then extroverts, maybe not so much in that scenario, but then, as you said, in a more formal scenario where they're pitching, let's say, to a room and it's more of a performance, and I say that in inverted commas, they've got more pizzazz. But I don't buy it. I never buy it, because I know you can have as much performance and show as you want, but you've got to back it up with the substance of your product or service. So I don't care if you're an introvert or an extrovert. I just care that there's substance and conviction in what you say and you can back it up. And that's fundamentally all that matters. So I don't agree that extroverts are necessarily better. I just think that they put on a better show, but that doesn't ultimately mean anything.
I see.
Do you see where I'm going with that?
Exactly. They can feel more comfortable during the pitching if we stick with the textbook definition of an extrovert, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the pitch is going to be more successful or going to convince more people.
Well, you've got to be able to back up your extravagant. Let's say you're making an extravagant claim, or you're making something sound epic, which is great. I love that. But you've got to be able to back it up with substance rather than just hyperbole. And I think often when for want of a better word, when people are being extroverted on stage. I know as an actor, if that's not backed up by gravitas, by experience, by research and by data, then it doesn't mean anything. So, and I can instantly see that when someone is pitching. So again, I don't look at extroversion or introversion. I look at, are you telling me a story that is inspiring me, and are you backing it up with substance, however you're delivering it? And it has to be a story. It has to be simple, and it has to be connected. You've got to win my trust. And, you know, regardless of extroversion or introversion, are you winning my trust? And I think that's really, really, really key for anyone in business.
I mean, that's a good way of putting that forward. Just to finalize the discussion, for now, to put it in parentheses, at least this discussion on introversion and extroversion, I personally used to be a more type of extrovert type of person, but with age and with different experience and exposure to different environments, I find myself being a different type of introvert. And going back to your comment, it depends on the situation, what you're feeling, the type of people that you're interacting with. So definitely. And the reason I wanted to touch on this topic is usually, hopefully in the audience, there are people who feel that they're introverts and that this is a roadblock for them to be good pitchers. And I just want them to know that this is definitely something that can be learned, and it can even be an advantage, because I think we are coming to the age of introversion in a sense, because introverts, they seem to be able to process and understand some minute details which turn out to be very critical in later parts of a deal, of a pitch, or of a conversation. So there are merits to both sides, and I think it's worth knowing them.
Let me add something there to what you said, because I agree with what you say. It may not sound it, and obviously you've met me in person and perhaps you don't think it, but when I was a teenager, I was incredibly shy, and I wasn't able to say very much, particularly in class. And I know lots of people will relate. I wasn't able to put up my hand. I wasn't able to add to a conversation. My cheeks used to burn and I used to sweat buckets. And I was so, what you might say, introverted. And then I went to drama school and I put myself in all sorts of terrifying situations and forced myself to swim. And I wouldn't say I've become an extrovert. I would say that I've just developed the skills to read situations and then to put my ideas forth, which is something I didn't have when I was a teenager. So I was seen as an introvert. Again, I struggle with those labels, but I used to just think I was very shy.
Yeah.
Very embarrassed. I used to get very embarrassed very easily. And I used to think everything I said was rubbish. And I work with a lot of introverts
now. Reason to scrap all those labels and really appreciate that human personality is a very fluid thing.
Because I work with a lot of tech people who are very highly skilled in their domains and very niche, they often struggle to articulate their research or their ideas, and they are what's considered to be the classic introvert because they're studious and they've got huge attention to detail, very much like my father actually. And what I remember about my dad and what I see in these people that I work with is that they're amazing, they're so intelligent, they're so smart, and they've got these fantastic ideas, but they don't know how to communicate them. And what they need to learn, and they can definitely learn this skill, is simply how to tell a story. And telling a story is really about reconnecting. And I know this is going to sound weird to say in a business setting, but it's about reconnecting to your inner child and rediscovering your creativity. And we all have it. And then learning to speak from that place and to tell a simple but true story about your idea and also realizing that it doesn't need to be perfect. You just have a go. And then you can turn your technical data into something really exciting.
Spot on. I mean, what I know on human behavior definitely supports what you're saying, because our brains are hardwired to understand in stories. Just think back to those ages where our ancestors used to sit around a fire, and the entirety of human knowledge has been communicated through stories for such a long while that our brains simply process and remember stories much better than they do raw data. So that's why that's spot on. Telling a story that is simple and true through rediscovering your creativity.
Yes, yes, and your innocence, as it were. I really believe in that. And my father, just to finish that off, my father was very technical and he invented something amazing, but he wasn't able to communicate it. So ultimately, it didn't work, which is a real shame. And so I'm determined to make sure that all you introverts out there, myself included, you don't allow your ideas to sink into obscurity, for sure. And it doesn't need to happen.
Looking back, would you say what you observed with your father has been some sort of inspiration to what you're doing today?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think about it all the time because obviously everything I do, everything that we all do is rooted in our history, and you can't get away from that. And I'm very rooted in my history. I reflect on it all the time. I think about how my mother influenced me and how my father influenced me, not always for the positive, but and I'm always trying to work out A, how not to repeat the same mistakes, and B, how to help other people not repeat the same mistakes. Because I think each generation tries to improve on the previous.
That's true. That's true. I mean, the human behavior is such a complex thing that
Oh,
sometimes what you think is a negative influence can be the most positive influence
yeah.
that has an indirect second order effect on your life,
Oh
right?
my goodness. Yeah. I mean, I haven't got time to go into it now and I don't want to bore people, but I mean, I've had a very difficult upbringing, hugely hard, and I struggled so much for so long and actually, and was in pain for a very long time. And now all of that is amazing because it's really helping me to understand other people and where they're coming from. And it's given me a huge gift. So as much as I hate it, I also am really grateful for it. So it's bittersweet, but it's ultimately great, I
I
think.
mean, what you say, honestly, what you say gives me goosebumps because
Yeah,
I'm not the most emotional person, but what makes me most emotional of all the things is the human potential for growth. That is the idea that and the quality we have as humans that I think is the most inspiring of all. The hardships really do grow people, and we have such a potential. And funnily enough, people tend to lean towards comfort and seek comfort and convenience in all areas of their life. But these days, and the way technology is heading, the way the world is heading, I think is an example that maximum convenience and maximum comfort is not essentially the best, not necessarily the best way to live a life, because that limits growth to a certain extent. And that is a dilemma because you cannot introduce hardship to your life in a manual or in a synthetic way. It has
mm,
that wouldn't make sense just to simply make your life harder for
no,
no reason. But there is some virtue and value in overcoming that hardship that really
yeah,
grows people, and I do love that. Um,
yes,
if you don't have anything critical to add to that, I'd like to segue to another point.
sure.
I think that can be of use for our listeners, and it is the process of practicing for a pitch, building up to a pitch, and maybe with that question, you might want to share some details. Should we be relying on materials or an internalized knowledge of the topic? Which do you think takes more priority?
Right. So I would like to ask you to define materials. I'm not quite sure what you mean by
Oh,
that.
I mean, like the keynotes, the pitch decks,
Ah,
the visual materials, and all that.
okay. So I don't think the pitch deck is key. I think it's important to have your deck and the slides behind you, sort of adding that extra touch. But you're the star of the show, so you need to definitely internalize your content and make sure you know it back to front, inside out, not necessarily word for word, because often when people learn their scripts, let's say, you formulate a script, you start with your problem, you go on to the solution, you talk about what your differential is, and then you lead into the unit economics, let's say. So you've got your script, and you need to know that inside out. However, not word for word, because what I find is that a lot of people learn their scripts word for word and end up sounding very robotic, and
Oh, I see.
brings us to what we spoke at the very beginning, which was the word spontaneity. It's much more important to be able to show your personality, your resilience in the moment, your ability to make a mistake in public, like maybe get a few words wrong or say the wrong thing, and then perhaps recover by cracking a joke, let's say, or just recover in some clever way, because you have to think in the moment. And then what you do is you show your entrepreneurial spirit whilst you're pitching, which is more important than getting the words perfect, because you might as well just email your pitch if you're not going to bring your personality into the room and show your grit and your potential. So that's why I say to people, don't learn it off by heart, and certainly don't practice it over and over in exactly the same way, because you'll turn into a robot. So it's much better to learn your content sort of by rote, almost like you're learning the phone book, and learn the structure of a pitch. Let's say you're giving a formal pitch. You want to learn the structure of that pitch, so you know where you're starting, where you're going to go to in the middle, and where you're going to end up. But don't learn it word for word. But practice speaking your pitch out loud to anyone that will listen. And actually, most importantly, get whoever listens to you, get whoever that person is, to ask you difficult questions.
Oh, that's a good one.
So that you can practice thinking in the moment what you might say when you're thrown. Because that's really, really important, because it ain't going to be easy. You know, some people will look to ask you challenging questions because they're feeling positive. Some people will actually look to trip you up. So you need to cover everything. And it's not about going onto stage or into a room and pretending you know everything. It's okay to admit that you don't know something, and that's actually very confident to do. But you need to have as much of your content and your business proposition thought out so that you've got enough ammo.
We lost a couple of seconds there, and I like what you said was it's about building ammo. And I took a note of key learning points, the fifth one, and I'm going to sum these up at the end and possibly with a blog post and share that with our audience as well. Practice answering challenging questions about what you are pitching. And I think this is a great advice.
Yes. And it's the most, because it will help you formulate your pitch as well, because those questions you can then feed back into your content. So if you're doing a more formal pitch where you're just speaking for 3 minutes, you get straight to the crux of what you need to say, because you know what your audience is silently thinking, because you've already been asked those questions beforehand.
I mean that's honestly fantastic advice. And that's one I'm going to take to heart and try to use in what I pitch, and share the knowledge with people, because it does a couple of things simultaneously. I think it increases your overall command of the topic, as well as increase your spontaneous conversation ability around the topic with people. So it is you who is communicating rather than the slides with the people, if that makes sense, right?
Yes, it's always got to be your opinion on what you're saying and your feeling as well. This comes back to empathy. Know your content so well that you can put your feeling into it and mean what you say, so that people really believe in you, because you believe in you. You're not just repeating a script. You're actually thinking live in the moment, like I am now with you. I've got no idea what I'm about to say, but I do know my content. I do know my stuff, because I've lived a life and I've really thought through things. So to be a really dynamic pitcher, you've got to, get to that point where you know your content so well, you've answered all these challenging questions, you've thought about it inside out, so you can step into the room and forget about it and simply be alive to the questions that are being asked there and then. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. I've been studying how brain works, and one book that I'm reading, and I suggest to anyone who's interested in human behavior, is a book called Behave by Robert Sapolsky. It's just sitting right in front of me, and it has all these fantastic information about the biology of the brain and how we learn. And I think it would say, try to move what you know from the memory and the prefrontal cortex to more the limbic systems of your system to the background, so that it's just like changing gears when you're driving a car, rather than your first time driving a vehicle.
Well, that's really I've got to tell you, my acting teacher years ago said to me, the best way to practice a play, I've got to learn a whole script for a play, is you just learn the words by rote. It's like learning to ride a bicycle. You learn all the moves, you learn the gear changes, you learn all the technicalities, and you get it so ingrained in your brain that you can move into, say, the limbic system, I think you said, and then you can step onto stage, forget about the whole technique, forget about the homework, and just enjoy the moment so that you can be creative and dynamic. And
That's
yeah.
that's a very good way of putting that. So another thing that I think is worth discussing, and I think is the amount of information on this topic is lacking, I would say. So I've been in London for more than a year now, and I'm trying to understand how business works and how people work here. So you've been here obviously much longer than me. And one trend that I have observed is London is a very dynamic and very fluid city, in the sense that a lot of people are coming in, but also a lot of people are leaving. And so it is just this cycle of new people coming in and going out. So, and I don't know the average time an entrepreneur lives in London. I don't have data on that. But one thing I noticed is doing business in the context of the UK can be very idiosyncratic. And as someone who knows, who understands the culture, do you have any comments on that? Do you have any suggestions to people who are coming in London to do business? What they need to be wary of, what they need to pay special attention to? What are some tactics that might work but they are not seeing, and how it is different than, say, the US or different parts of Europe? I really would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Wow, I really hope I'm able to answer that question. I'm not sure I've never thought of it that way, because the way I see people, maybe I just don't consciously think of culture. I always think of, who is this person in front of me? This very individual, because I work with, as you said, there are so many cultures in London in itself. So one day I'll be working with a group of people from China. I'll be working with entrepreneurs from India. Then it'll be Koreans, and then French and German. I never know where I'm going to be. And so I've learned to look past the nationality and just see the person, the human being in front of me. And then each human being, even within a culture, is so different from another that I cannot predict, or I don't feel like I can advise on, and this is probably not very helpful, but I don't feel like I can advise on what tools and tactics you might use, apart from putting your attention fully, let's say you're in a meeting, putting your attention fully on the human in front of you and asking them open-ended questions, getting them to talk and creating a human connection with them, regardless of their culture, regardless of how long they've even been in the UK, but finding out about them and just asking them really basic human questions like, how long have you been here? How do you find it? Just getting to know that person so that you create that connection, and then you'll be able to have a much more empowering business conversation, because there'll be a level of trust in the room. So it's not like I can say, this is how it is in England and this is how you should be, because for me that's very much a one size fits all stereotype, and I've learned, for me anyway, it just doesn't work. I'm not, as you can probably tell by now, I'm not into quick fixes, because I don't believe it works. And you also have to be aware that from every culture and from every place in the world, there are some people that are great to do business with, and there are some people that are just going to be really impossible to deal with. And it doesn't matter where they're from. And I think the biggest skill to learn is to figure out the person in front of you as quickly as possible. And you do that by asking questions and listening and paying attention. And you'll pretty quickly work out their motivations, and you'll be able to figure out whether their intentions are good, and they mostly are. But there are some unfortunate people who you just don't want to be working with. So again, I haven't quite answered your question specifically, because I don't believe I can, but that's how I do it. And I'm Turkish. I am from a Turkish family, but I was born and brought up in this country. So I've been to Turkey every summer, and I've traveled the world since the age of 3, because my parents were travelers. So I've met people from all over the world. And again, it comes down to the human in front of me, not the culture. So, yeah.
I see where you're coming from. And understanding combining what you're saying on this topic with what we've been talking about, it makes absolute perfect sense that you think this way. For me, I try to make a deliberate effort to understand how each culture differs from the other. And one thing that I've noticed is the role of humor takes the main stage more in London based UK based communication, I would say. But you could answer saying it is international, and I would agree with that. But one thing that seems to be really idiosyncratic is the understated nature of communicating your successes and your accomplishments. So what are your thoughts on that, comparing the standard, maybe United States-centric way of sharing your accomplishments versus that's in a UK setting?
Sure. So I think you're asking me the difference between the understatement of the Brits and the enthusiasm and zealousness of the Americans in terms of sales.
In terms of yes, in terms of sales and in terms of communicating their past, their successes and their careers, I would say.
So what I discovered, or what I find in general, is yeah, you're right. The Brits often like to downplay their successes or their strengths, and they often don't even believe that there is value in some of their strengths. So a lot of it's a self-esteem issue that manifests itself as, you know, let's play this down. Let's not take our space. Let's sort of semi-apologize for our existence. And then in America, yeah, in America, they go the other way, and it's like, we're amazing. You know, this is so fantastic. And you're like, chill out. And I actually think they're both flip sides of the very same coin of not being able to be authentic. Because I don't believe authenticity has to be overexcitement or overzealousness.
So
but nor does it have to be downplaying. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Nor does it have to be downplaying your the value of your proposition. It should be the middle line of just being straight, of just saying, this is what it is. And it is great. It's fantastic. This is what we can do. These are the problems that we solve. And we solve them brilliantly by doing A, B, and C. And we have some weaknesses at the moment. So you be honest about your weaknesses and you say those authentically. But you're looking to fix them, and you know that you will, and you're doing your research. So it's more of an honest conversation rather than, you know, this over the top approach to cover the fact that underneath you're not quite sure about what you're saying. So maybe you might like to call that the imposter syndrome. And equally, the downplaying of something doesn't do yourself any justice. You don't want to be downplaying something, because if you devalue your message, the audience will think that your business proposition isn't that great. That will be the subliminal message. So I think we need to find a middle ground between those two approaches. And I think that's what I aim for anyway with the people that I work with. It's very much about how can we be honest whilst being very positive, but not downplaying, you know, not lying.
Being overzealous and using understatement tends to be sides of the same coin, you said, and I think that coin can be being comfortable with yourself. So if you're not comfortable with yourself, you tend to be overzealous or understatement heavy. But I think this is a very elegant way of putting that again, and I took note of that. I think it's a very beneficial point that makes sense within your whole philosophy of authenticity and being there in real time and having true, simple stories and honest conversations with people. Do not go either way in extreme. And if you're comfortable with yourself, with your past, with your accomplishments, then it's gonna sound the best across the cultures. Is that a right way of putting that?
Yeah, absolutely. You nailed it. It's very much about I liked what you said about being comfortable in your own skin so that you can be truthful about what you do and know your strengths, know your weaknesses, and there's no shame in any of it. And just speaking truthfully rather than going to that old school, and I think it's dying now, that it's very much over the top sales techniques that, you know, have sort of been passed down the generations, that kind of snake oil type selling, which I don't buy into. But ultimately, we don't want to undersell ourselves either by going the opposite direction. So it's finding that authentic middle ground. It's very important.
Very well put. Well, I mean, it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I'm glad we did this
Yeah,
podcast.
me
Uh,
too.
so, if people want to reach you, which channels should they follow? Where should they follow? How can they reach you? How can they follow you? And is there anything that you'd like to add and draw attention to that you're building or working on at the moment?
Yeah. So the best way to, well, you can go on my website, which is amytez.com, and you can sign up to my newsletter. So I write articles probably about once a month. So I'm quite busy, but I like to write something at least once a month and get it out there. So if you're interested to hear more of my thoughts, you can definitely sign up to my newsletter. I'm not very active on social media. I'm not going to lie to you, because everything I do, I prefer to do word of mouth. I'm a little bit old school, and it suits me fine. Um, so I think the website's the best way to get hold of me, and then you'll get news of my upcoming events whenever I do talks. Sometimes I go out there and I do talks in various locations across London and sometimes in Europe. So that would be a nice way of keeping in touch with my work. And who knows, it may expand. Well, I'm hoping it will. It definitely will. And and then you can keep a track of it via my newsletter. Yeah.
Well, Amy, thank you again for taking the time for this recording. Startup sessions. Amy Tez,
Thank
thank you a
you.
lot.
Nice to talk to you.
I hope I'll see you again in face to face somewhere in London.
Mm,
Uh, and, and take care.
yes, you too. Nice to talk to you.
Have a great day. Bye bye.